There is a moment in a 1961 film where Sophia Loren sits in the rubble of a bombed-out village, her face streaked with dirt and tears, her eyes carrying something that no acting coach could ever teach. The audience watching that scene had no idea they were witnessing something close to memory. She had actually lived in rubble. She had actually known hunger. She had actually watched the world she loved get torn apart around her. By that point, she was the most photographed woman on the planet. Magazines couldn't get enough of her. Hollywood had offered her everything. And yet behind all of it, behind the gowns and the cameras and the Oscar and the men who claimed to love her, was a story that the glamour was always trying to cover up. This is that story, The Girl from Pozzuoli. On September 20th, 1934, a baby girl was born out of wedlock in a charity ward in Rome. Her mother, Romilda Villani, was 22 years old, unmarried, and alone. The father, Riccardo Ciccolone, was a failed engineer who had drifted into work for the National Railway. A man who had seduced Romilda with the kind of charm that made promises he never intended to keep. He acknowledged the child only enough to give her his surname, and then, for the most part, disappeared. The baby was named Sophia Villani Ciccolone. The world would eventually know her as Sophia Loren. But for the first years of her life, she was simply a poor child in a poor country during one of the worst periods in modern history, growing up in the shadow of a man who wanted nothing to do with her. Romilda moved with the infant Sophia to Pozzuoli, a small coastal town near Naples, where her own parents lived. Pozzuoli was not a gentle place to grow up. It was working class, dense, prone to the kind of poverty that doesn't apologize for itself. The Villani household was crowded and loud, full of aunts and cousins and the particular chaos of a large southern Italian family trying to survive on very little. Sophia grew up thin, so thin that the neighborhood children called her Sticksetto, which meant little stick. She was also called La Stuzzicadenti, the toothpick. Children are not subtle and they were not kind. She was pale, angular, and visibly hungry in a way that other children noticed and used against her. Food was scarce. The family scraped by. Her mother worked wherever she could, dreaming of a different life and passing that dream with some force onto her daughters. Because Romilda had a dream of her own that had never been realized. In 1932, she had won an MGM-sponsored contest to find the Italian woman who looked most like Greta Garbo, the prize being a trip to Hollywood and a screen test. But she was only 17 and her parents refused to let her go, considering America too dangerous a place for a young woman alone. That denied prize, that life unlived, became an ember. Romilda tended for decades, directing its heat towards Sophia as the girl grew older. Then the war arrived. Italy entered World War II in June 1940, when Sophia was 5 years old. The consequences in Pozzuoli were not abstract. The town sat near a major industrial port and became a target. Allied bombing raids struck repeatedly. The Villani family fled their home more than once, sheltering in rail tunnels while the bombs fell nearby. Sophia would later describe the experience of crouching in those tunnels, the noise, the darkness, the smell of fear from the people pressed around her, as something that never fully left her. During one of the raids, a fragment of shrapnel struck her on the chin, leaving a small scar she would carry for the rest of her life. She was 6 years old. The war did something else to her, too. It starved her. Pozzuoli, like much of southern Italy, suffered severe food shortages during the occupation and the Allied campaign. There were days when there was simply nothing to eat. She would later speak about the sensation of genuine hunger, not appetite, but hunger, the kind that makes a child understand, at a cellular level, that her survival is not guaranteed. That knowledge, once absorbed, does not simply go away when the food returns. By the end of the war, Sophia was 11 years old, malnourished, fatherless in any meaningful sense, and living in a town that had been half destroyed. She had also watched her mother carry the particular bitterness of a woman who had been promised something and had it taken away. Romilda's interrupted screen test, her aborted shot at a different life, had curdled over the years into a kind of ferocious ambition that she transferred wholesale onto her daughters and onto Sophia in particular. It was not always comfortable to be the vessel for another person's unlived dreams, but it was also, in a way that would take years to understand, the fuel for everything that came next. Because something had happened during those years of deprivation that would alter the course of everything. She had started to grow. What happened next? The transformation from a scrawny, hungry child into the woman who would stop traffic in Rome is one of the most unlikely stories in the history of cinema. But it didn't come without a cost, the making of a goddess. By the time Sophia was 14, the toothpick had become something else entirely. The post-war years brought food back to the table, and the combination of adolescence and recovered nutrition transformed her with a speed that astonished everyone around her. She grew tall. Her features, which had seemed too sharp and prominent on a thin child's face, resolved into something extraordinary. She was not conventionally pretty in the way that Italian beauty standards of the period defined prettiness. She was too angular, too full-lipped, her nose too strong. But she was magnetic in a way that conventional prettiness rarely is. Romilda noticed, and Romilda acted. In 1949, when Sophia was 15, Romilda brought her to Naples to enter a beauty contest called the Queen of the Sea. Sophia came in second, but the experience was enough to confirm what Romilda had suspected. The girl had something that cameras would find, that crowds would respond to, that the entertainment industry, slowly rebuilding itself in post-war Italy, might be willing to pay for. The following year, Romilda took Sophia to Rome. She was still 15. Handsome man. He was short, with a large nose, and the kind of physical presence that money tends to amplify rather than replace. They entered the Miss Roma pageant, and it was there that Sophia caught the attention of several people connected to the Italian film industry. And, more fatally, she caught the attention of a 37-year-old film producer named Carlo Ponti. Ponti was not a handsome man. He was short, with a large nose, and the kind of physical presence that money tends to amplify rather than replace. But he was enormously powerful in the Italian film world, genuinely intelligent, and he had an eye for talent that was, by all professional accounts, extraordinary. When he saw Sophia in Rome that summer, he understood immediately that what he was looking at was not simply a beautiful girl. It was a career. It was possibly a phenomenon. He arranged a screen test. She was offered small roles in minor productions, fumetti, photo novels that were enormously popular in post-war Italy, where she posed for illustrated story magazines. She was paid barely enough to matter, but the work gave her something invaluable: experience in front of a camera, and a growing understanding of how to use her face. She also, at Ponti's insistence, changed her name. Sophia Ciccolone became Sophia Loren, the surname borrowed loosely from the Swedish actress Marta Torén, with the spelling adjusted. The new name was harder, more international, easier to say in languages other than Italian. It was the name of a different person than the hungry girl from Pozzuoli. That was partly the point. Between 1950 and 1954, Sophia appeared in more than a dozen Italian films, comedies, dramas, historical spectacles. She was rarely the lead. She was the beautiful woman in the corner of the frame, or the scene stealer in a secondary role, or the face that the camera returned to a beat longer than the script required. Directors noticed. Audiences noticed. And Carlo Ponti, who was guiding her career with careful deliberation, was maneuvering her toward something larger. What nobody was discussing openly, what was present in every room but rarely named, was the nature of the relationship between the young actress and her producer. Sophia was a teenager when she met Ponti. He was decades older, married to another woman, and in a position of complete professional authority over her. The relationship became romantic. Whether it was something she chose freely or whether the power dynamics made genuine choice complicated is something she has addressed carefully over the years, acknowledging the relationship without reducing it to simple terms. What is clear is that by the early 1950s, Ponti and Sophia were inseparable professionally and personally. He shaped her career. He chose her roles. He managed her image. And she, by all accounts, loved him. Though the road to anything resembling a stable life together would prove far more treacherous than either of them anticipated. Before any of that could be resolved, Hollywood came calling. And Hollywood, in the 1950s, was a place that could make a person or unmake them, sometimes both at once. Hollywood and its hunger. By 1955, Sophia Loren was the most talked about actress in Europe. The Italian film industry had given her the tools, and she had used them with a discipline and intelligence that surprised people who expected beauty to substitute for effort. She was not simply decorative. She was a worker. She studied. She prepared. She arrived on set knowing her lines and everyone else's. Directors remarked repeatedly on the gap between what they expected and what they found, that behind the extraordinary face was a woman who treated filmmaking as a craft that demanded rigor. Paramount Pictures signed her to a 5-picture contract in 1956, and her first English-language films began arriving in 1957. She was 22 years old when she arrived in Hollywood for the first time, speaking limited English, carrying with her the sensibility of a woman who had grown up in genuine poverty and was determined never to return to it. She carried also a complete absence of the reverence for Hollywood that American actresses of her generation were expected to perform. She had not grown up dreaming of the Hollywood sign. She had grown up dreaming of food. Hollywood received her with a particular kind of hunger that had very little to do with her acting ability. The studios knew what they had: a European woman whose physicality broke the American mold of femininity, whose accent made everything she said sound like an invitation, and whose face the camera adored with an almost embarrassing consistency. They dressed her up. They photographed her. They put her in films opposite Cary Grant, Charlton Heston, Frank Sinatra, John Wayne, the biggest male stars in the world. The films were not always worthy of her. The Pride and the Passion, in 1957, opposite Cary Grant and Frank Sinatra, was a sprawling historical epic that critics received coolly. Houseboat, also with Grant in 1958, was lighter and warmer, but not exactly demanding material. Hollywood was still figuring out what to do with her, how to harness something that didn't fit neatly into the categories it already had. She was too intelligent for pure spectacle, too foreign for easy domesticity, too physically striking to be cast simply as a character actress. The studios kept reaching for her and kept finding that their hands weren't quite big enough to hold what they'd grabbed. Her experience of American fame also carried a disorientation that she has spoken about with characteristic frankness. In Italy, she was known. In Hollywood, she was looked at. The difference mattered to her. Being known meant that people had some sense of where you'd come from, what you'd done to get there, who you actually were beneath the surface. Being looked at was something else. A sensation she described as simultaneously intoxicating and dehumanizing. The feeling of being an object of extraordinary interest without anyone particularly caring what the object thought or felt. What happened off-screen during these years was considerably more interesting than most of what happened on it. Cary Grant fell in love with her. This is not gossip. It is documented and acknowledged. Grant, who was in his 50s and one of the most desired men in world, pursued Sophia with a sincerity that seems to have genuinely moved and genuinely troubled her. She cared for him. She admired him enormously. But her heart, as complicated as the situation was, belonged to Carlo Ponti. She chose Ponti. Grant eventually accepted the loss, though people who knew him well have said it stayed with him. Frank Sinatra was less gracious. He had expected a different kind of relationship with his European co-star and did not receive it. His behavior on set, which people who were there have described as cold and occasionally contemptuous after he understood she wasn't interested, made filming difficult. Sophia endured it with the composure of someone who had endured considerably worse. What she could not endure as easily was the particular way that Hollywood fame worked on her identity. The studios packaged her as a kind of exotic object, the Italian bombshell, the Mediterranean fire, in a way that reduced the complexity she actually possessed to a single, easily marketable note. She was smart enough to know this was happening and strategic enough to work within it while looking for ways out. The way out, she understood, was not American film. It was European film. Specifically, it was Italian neorealism, the movement that cared about faces like hers for entirely different reasons. The opportunity came in 1960 when director Vittorio De Sica offered her the lead role in La Ciociara, known in English as Two Women. It was not a glamorous role. It was not a role that played to her image. It is the story of a mother in wartime Italy trying to protect her daughter. And it required her to shed every layer of the goddess and find the woman underneath. What she did with that role would change not just her career, but the way the world understood what she was capable of. And the recognition that followed came at exactly the moment when everything else in her life was beginning to crack. The Oscar, the bigamy charge, and the price of love. In April 1962, Sophia Loren became the first actor to win an Academy Award for a foreign language performance. She won Best Actress for 2 women, and she was not in the room when it happened. She had been advised not to attend because the outcome was considered uncertain. And the journey from Rome to Los Angeles was significant. When the news reached her in Italy, she wept. The performance was genuinely extraordinary. De Sica, who knew her better than almost any director who worked with her, had understood that the material she needed was not romance or comedy, but suffering. The kind of suffering she had actual physical memory of. He gave her that material and then stepped back and let her use it. In the film, she plays Caesira, a Roman shopkeeper who flees south with her teenage daughter during the German occupation, and who witnesses her daughter suffer a violent attack at the hands of soldiers. One of the most harrowing sequences in post-war Italian cinema. The grief and rage Sophia brought to those scenes were not invented. They were excavated from something real, something that the war years in Pozzuoli had deposited in her, and that she had never had a proper occasion to spend. The Oscar should have been a moment of pure triumph. In some ways it was, but it arrived in the middle of a personal crisis that had been building for years and had now reached a point where it could not be managed quietly anymore. The problem was Carlo Ponti. Or more precisely, the problem was that Carlo Ponti was still married to his first wife, Giuliana Fiastri, when he and Sophia had formalized their relationship in a proxy marriage in Mexico in 1957. Italy, at the time, did not recognize divorce. The Catholic Church, which still exerted enormous legal and cultural power in Italian civil life, did not recognize the Mexican marriage as valid. The Italian government agreed with the Church. In 1960, Italian prosecutors charged both Sophia and Carlo Ponti with bigamy. This was not a technicality. Bigamy was a criminal offense in Italy, carrying the possibility of imprisonment. The charges attracted enormous press attention. Here was the most famous woman in Italy, fresh off her Oscar, facing the prospect of going to prison for the crime of loving the man she considered her husband. The situation required a solution that Italian law could not provide. So they found one elsewhere. In 1962, Ponti obtained a French divorce from his first wife, and he and Sophia became French citizens. They were remarried under French law in Paris in April 1966. The Italian bigamy charges were eventually dropped, but the years of legal uncertainty, public scrutiny, and the particular indignity of having her private life treated as a criminal matter had left marks that didn't show up in photographs. There was something else corroding those years, too. Sophia desperately wanted children. This desire, which she has spoken about with more raw honesty than almost any other subject in her life, became the source of the most private and prolonged suffering she experienced. Between 1967 and 1969, she suffered 2 miscarriages. The first came after a pregnancy that had been carefully managed under medical supervision. She lost the baby in the 5th month. The grief was devastating. She tried again. The second pregnancy also ended in loss. She did not speak publicly about these losses at the time in any real depth. The culture of the era, even for a woman as visible as Sophia Loren, did not create much space for public grief over miscarriage. She was expected to be stoic, to move forward, to remain the goddess, composed and luminous, whatever was happening inside. What was happening inside, by all accounts, was something close to despair. The story of how she finally became a mother, and what she was willing to do and endure to get there, is one of the most quietly heroic chapters of her life. But before that, there were other storms to survive. The years of siege. Fame for Sophia Loren was never a simple gift. From the moment she became recognizable in Italy and then across the world, she became a target in ways that went beyond the normal pressures of celebrity. The Italian press had a particular relationship with her that was never entirely affectionate. She was adored and resented in equal measure, celebrated as a national treasure on one page and mocked or diminished on the next. Her origins were a constant subtext. She was not from a distinguished family. She was illegitimate. She was from the South, from Pozzuoli, from poverty. For certain corners of Italian society, no amount of Oscar glory could entirely launder those facts. There was a recurring pattern in Italian coverage of her. The story that needed to be told was never simply about her work. It was always also about her body, her origins, her marriage, her money. The suspicion that she had somehow gotten more than she deserved. Her relationship with Ponti attracted a specific kind of contempt that had class and gender woven through it. A beautiful young woman and an older, powerful man. The assumption was always that she had risen through proximity to his power rather than through her own talent. This interpretation required ignoring the actual evidence of her work, but it was persistent. She was never quite allowed, in some Italian circles, to be simply what she was, a woman of genuine, demonstrated, extraordinary ability. The international press was different in texture, but not always in intent. In America and Britain, coverage of her personal life was voracious and frequently distorted. Rumors were printed as fact. Photographs were taken without consent and published without apology. The boundaries that might protect an ordinary person's privacy did not apply to someone of her fame. And there seemed to be a particular appetite for any story that might puncture the mythology, that might catch the goddess being merely human. What the press could not manufacture, reality occasionally provided. In 1982, Sophia Loren returned to Italy from her home in Geneva and was arrested. The charge was tax evasion. The Italian government claimed she owed back taxes on income earned years earlier. She was taken into custody and held in a prison outside Rome for 17 days before being released. The images from that period, Sophia Loren, 50 years old, one of the most celebrated women in the world, led into a prison facility, circulated everywhere. She has described the experience as one of the most humiliating of her life. Not merely the fact of imprisonment, but the deliberate public spectacle of it. The way it was handled had the quality of a statement, a reminder, perhaps, that no amount of fame or beauty placed a person above the reach of institutional power when that institution decided to assert itself. She served her time, paid what was demanded, and returned to her life. But the episode illustrated something about the particular nature of her relationship with Italy, a country that had given her everything and seemed at intervals to resent her for it. Through all of this, through the legal battles and the press hostility and the miscarriages and the public spectacle, she worked. She continued to make films. She raised her sons. Carlo Jr., born in 1968 after a pregnancy spent entirely in bed under medical supervision, and Eduardo, born in 1973. She remained, against considerable pressure, married to Carlo Ponti. She did not collapse, at least not visibly. She endured with a stubbornness that people who grew up genuinely hungry tend to possess. The knowledge, bone deep, that things have been worse and that survival is possible. But endurance is not the same as peace. And the question of whether Sophia Loren ever truly found peace in her marriage, in her relationship with her own history, in her complicated place in the culture that made her, runs underneath everything that came after. Carlo Ponti and the truth of that marriage. It is impossible to tell Sophia Loren's story honestly without spending real time with Carlo Ponti, with who he was, what their relationship actually consisted of, and what it cost her. Ponti died in January 2007 at the age of 94. By that point, they had been together in some form for more than 50 years, a span of time that encompassed the entirety of her adult life. He had discovered her, named her, shaped her career, married her twice, fathered her children, and remained, by all visible evidence, her central attachment until the end. The comfortable version of the story is the one that Sophia herself has often told in interviews, that he was her mentor and then her great love, that the age difference was irrelevant, that the unconventional beginning of their relationship should not be held against what it became. There is genuine truth in this version. People who knew them in their later years have consistently described a real partnership, a couple who talked about films and ideas and laughed together and understood each other in ways that time alone can build. She has described him as the person who made her feel safe in a world that had never reliably offered her safety. Coming from a woman who had survived what she had survived, that statement carries considerable weight. But there is another part of the story that the comfortable version requires looking past. Ponti was a man of his era and his culture, which is to say he kept what he wanted and discarded what he no longer found useful. His first marriage ended not through any crisis of feeling, but because he had found someone younger and more compelling. There were, over the decades, persistent reports of other women, not one or two isolated incidents, but a pattern of behavior that people in their circle apparently accepted as simply how Ponti was. Sophia, by the accounts of people who were close to them, knew. She chose to stay. The reasons for that choice are her own, and she has never explained them in terms that fully satisfy the question. She has talked about love. She has talked about her children. She has talked about the life they built together and the work he made possible. What she has not talked about, at least not publicly, is what it cost to absorb those betrayals and continue. What can be said is that she built her life around him in a way that made her, in certain respects, dependent. Not financially, she was never that, but structurally. Her homes, her schedule, her geography, her social world were all organized around Ponti's preferences and Ponti's career. When they moved to Geneva for tax reasons, she went. When he preferred a particular style of life, she accommodated it. The woman who had clawed her way out of Pozzuoli with extraordinary self-determination had, in her private life, structured herself around someone else's center of gravity. After he died, friends who saw her in the months that followed described a woman who seemed genuinely lost, not performing grief, actually lost. Whatever the complications of the marriage, whatever she had absorbed and set aside over the decades, he had been the architecture of her daily life for longer than most people's entire adult existence. His absence was not simply emotional loss. It was structural collapse. She rebuilt. She is, at her core, someone who rebuilds. She returned to film, most notably in a 2020 Netflix production directed by her son, Eduardo, for which she received significant critical praise at the age of 86. She remained present. She remained visible. The goddess, still standing, still luminous, still carrying everything she had always carried. But there is one more chapter to this story, one that reaches back further than Hollywood, further than Ponti, all the way to the beginning, to the father who was never there, and what his absence did to the woman who had to grow up without him. The father, the daughter, and the wound that didn't close. Riccardo Ciccolone gave Sophia his surname and very little else. He was present in her early childhood in the most minimal sense, occasionally appearing, occasionally disappearing, never committing to the role of father in any way that a child could rely on. Romilda never married him. He had a legitimate family elsewhere. Sophia and her younger sister Maria were, in the legal and social terms of the era, his illegitimate children. A category that, in Catholic Italy of the 1930s and 1940s, carried a stigma that attached itself to the child, rather than to the adult who had created the situation. Ciccolone was not a villain in the cinematic sense. He was something more mundane and, in some ways, more damaging. A man who was simply absent, who did not prioritize his daughters, who did not show up for the things that matter when a child is growing up. The illnesses, the school events, the moments of crisis, the ordinary Tuesday evenings when a father's presence means something that his absence confirms is not coming. What Sophia has said about him in various interviews across the decades is instructive precisely because of how controlled it is. She does not perform bitterness. She does not deliver dramatic condemnations. She speaks about him in measured, almost clinical terms, acknowledging the facts, declining to editorialize too heavily, allowing the facts themselves to carry whatever weight they carry. That kind of careful control is often a sign that the feeling underneath is not measured at all. There was a brief, strange episode later in her life when Ciccolone attempted to leverage their connection, apparently approaching her after she became famous, when his daughter's name could open doors that his own could not. The encounter, by the accounts of people Sophia later confided in, was painful in ways that were difficult to articulate. Not because he was cruel, but because the visit confirmed what she had always known, that he had come not because he felt something, but because she had become useful. She did not give him what he was looking for. She helped him modestly, in the way that a person might help a stranger in need, not coldly, but without the warmth that a father might reasonably expect to find there, because he had not built anything between them that could produce that warmth. The account is one of quiet devastation. A daughter who had become everything her father had not helped her become, meeting him in the knowledge that the help had never been offered. Her own experience of fatherhood, watching Carlo Ponti with their sons, and later watching her sons become fathers themselves, became something she spoke about with a tenderness that had deprivation at its source. She knew what a present father looked like because she had never had one. She understood its value in the specific way that absence teaches. Her sons have spoken about her as a mother with the kind of unstinting love and admiration that suggests she gave them deliberately and completely everything that had not been given to her. That choice, the deliberate, conscious decision to break a cycle rather than perpetuate it, is perhaps the least glamorous and most genuine heroic act of her life. What the goddess carried. There is a version of Sophia Loren's story that is entirely triumph. The girl from Potswali who conquered Hollywood. The actress who won the Oscar. The beauty who outlasted every other beauty of her generation. This version is not wrong. It is just incomplete. The complete version includes the hunger. Literal, physical hunger. The kind that leaves a mark on the nervous system. It includes the father who did not come. The mother whose own thwarted dreams became a weight as much as a gift. The man she loved who was never entirely faithful. The children she lost before she could hold them. The bigamy charges. The prison cell. The press that adored her and punished her in the same breath. What she built on top of all of that, not instead of it but on top of it, with it still present underneath, was something that the word career does not adequately describe. She made over 100 films across 7 decades. She worked with Vittorio De Sica, Federico Fellini, Charlie Chaplin, Robert Altman, Rob Marshall. She performed in 5 languages. She won an Academy Award, a BAFTA, a Grammy, multiple David Di Donatello Awards, an honorary Oscar for Lifetime Achievement in 1991, and a second competitive Oscar nomination in 1964 for Marriage, Italian Style. She also raised 2 sons who by every available account are decent, thoughtful, capable human beings, which, given where she started and what she came from, is not a small thing. There is something worth dwelling on in the sheer duration of her. She did not peak and fade. She did not burn bright and collapse. She did not disappear into comfort or bitterness or the particular entropy that undoes so many people who reach the heights she reached in their 20s. At an age when most performers have long since retreated, she was still taking roles, still showing up, still bringing to the work the same intelligence and preparation that she had brought to it in 1950 in a Roman studio with Carlo Ponti watching from across the room. In 2020, at 86 years old, she starred in The Life Ahead directed by her son, Eduardo, as a Holocaust survivor running a makeshift home for the children of street workers in southern Italy. The role required her to be old, worn, tender, fierce, and alive in ways that had nothing to do with beauty. She was all of those things. Critics who had grown up watching her on their parents' television sets found themselves genuinely startled by what they were watching. Not a legend performing her own legacy, but an actress doing her job. But perhaps the most telling detail is this. Throughout all of it, she never entirely lost the girl from Potswali. She kept the accent. She returned, again and again, to Naples, to the food, the people, the noise and warmth and difficult beauty of the place that had made her. When she spoke about who she was, she did not reach first for Hollywood or for Cannes or for the Oscar. She reached for the memory of her grandmother's kitchen, for the smell of the sea at Potswali, for the specific quality of southern Italian light on a childhood street. The goddess was always a performance, however brilliant a performance it was. The woman underneath it, the one who had survived the bombs and the hunger and the father who never came and the grief of the children she lost and the humiliation of the prison cell, that woman was not a performance. That woman was what made the performance possible. Sophia Loren turned 90 years old in September 2024. She remains one of the most recognizable human beings alive, and she carries, as she has always carried, a great deal more than the camera ever caught. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.